of the KDU, the chair, ladies and gentlemen. It gives me great pleasure this morning to pontificate on non-alignment at the crux of Sri Lanka's foreign policy since 2009, which is of unquestionable significance. Undoubtedly, Sri Lanka's non-aligned foreign policy had a direct impact on the denouement of the protracted conflict in 2009 in Sri Lanka. Nonetheless, President Rajapaksa, through his election manifesto in 2005, emphatically emphasized that he will adopt a policy of non-alignment. Furthermore, he reiterated the fact that non-alignment will be at the crux of Sri Lanka's foreign policy at his 65th Independence Day speech in Trincomalee. Then, of course, non-alignment to a greater extent has benefited Sri Lanka in trying to mitigate the harshness of international challenges in the number of international fora. And it also has helped Sri Lanka to accelerate its economic development. In my paper, I have extensively discussed that particular fact. And of course, one may question as to whether the Look East policy have made unpardonable inroads into the non-aligned foreign policy of Sri Lanka, given the fact that the contemporary world order is drastically changing, where there's a diffusion of power from the west to the east. I would like to entertain a couple of questions, if there are any, on that particular point, towards the latter part of this presentation. In trying to analyze foreign policy, one must take into account George Modelsky's and Jeffrey Stern's definitions of foreign policy. And of course, I have also tried to deal with the distinction between domestic policy and foreign policy. These two are symbiotically interrelated, and therefore it is hardly distinguishable. Nonetheless, you should also take into account the internal, external, and policy-making factors in formulating a foreign policy in any country, of any country, rather. And of course, since non-alignment is at the crux, and I have particularly highlighted non-alignment in my title, I've tried to make a distinction between neutrality and non-alignment. You know, neutrality is a Eurocentric concept, whereas non-alignment is a much more mutated form of neutrality. The next chapter of my research paper is titled, Fascinatingly Rajapaksa, Miliband and Kuchner. Of course, we are very well knowledgeable about the ulterior motives about the former British Secretary and the former French Minister when they hastily arrived in Sri Lanka towards the latter stages of the conflict, with the intention of pressurizing the Sri Lankan government to halt immediately the conflict under the guise of responsibility to protect. And of course, disappointed duo went back to the United Nations Security Council and tried to bring up this issue at the United Nations Security Council. Fortunately, we had our bosom friends. Russia was the president of the United Nations Security Council back then, together with China and other like-minded countries, vehemently condemned such moves and blocked that particular move where these two European delegates were concerned. This emphasizes that Sri Lanka's non-aligned foreign policy had benefited immensely in combating such challenges in the international forum. Nonetheless, one may think that the British government was very much hostile towards Sri Lanka towards the latter stages of the conflict. But Sri Lanka, adopting a non-aligned foreign policy, has been able to maintain cordial relations with every country in the world. And the British government's confirmation of their participation at the 2013 CHOGM in Sri Lanka tangibly establishes that the Sri Lanka is maintaining a non-aligned foreign policy. Furthermore, one may argue that the United States was also hostile towards Sri Lanka when they decreased the amount of aid provided to Sri Lanka in 2007 in combating terrorism. But in 2009, one must not forget that it was the United States Navy's Pacific Command which helped Sri Lanka in alerting the presence of floating arsenals in international waters. Correct me if I'm wrong, our Sri Lanka Navy was capable of destroying those arms shipments in international waters because the United States provided with such information. So there is non-alignment at work. Then, of course, the next chapter concentrates on the involvement of multiple actors in the post-conflict scenario in Sri Lanka. Of course, China has replaced all the traditional donors to Sri Lanka, and China has emerged as the #1 donor, financial donor to Sri Lanka. Of course, US has also provided a sufficient amount of aid, and of course, there are a number of bilateral agreements struck between Eastern European countries and Sri Lanka. And of course, Iran has also a say with regard to post-conflict reconciliation and rebuilding in the north and the east. And that, of course, reflects the non-aligned foreign policy of Sri Lanka. India and Pakistan is also extensively involved in such matters. And it was recently reported that Sri Lanka is going to enter into a nuclear pact with Pakistan. One may also question the fact that Sri Lanka is not quite friendly with the African countries. It was under the Rajapaksa administration that Afro-Asian solidarity was considered as pivotal. And of course, in my research paper, I have extensively discussed, by giving numbers, our involvement with the emerging markets in the African continent. Well, of course, the conclusion, as the concluding remark, I would like to stress the fact that Sri Lanka has immensely benefited from a non-aligned foreign policy. And this non-aligned foreign policy orientation of Sri Lanka has enabled Sri Lanka to meet its challenges. That is why Sri Lanka is aspiring to become the hub of South Asia, or the wonder of Asia. Sri Lanka, as a number of presenters yesterday, is at the middle of a number of international sea lines of communication. And it is pivotal and it is vital for Sri Lanka to understand that there are non-traditional security challenges in the Indian Ocean region, particularly piracy. And that is why Sri Lanka has established a dialogue with maritime powers such as Japan, Russia, the United States, China, and Australia in combating piracy. And of course, in Sri Lanka, with a non-aligned foreign policy, has been able to maintain cordial relations and establish itself in the international arena. Although Sri Lanka is the cynosure of the United Nations Human Rights Council, Sri Lanka has nevertheless exerted its influence with regard to disarmament and nuclear non-proliferation, thus engaging actively with the United Nations organization. Sri Lanka's ability to host the 2013 Shogam shall be earmarked as a diplomatic victory, mainly attributable to Sri Lanka's non-aligned foreign policy. Sri Lanka is increasingly becoming a global player with such a position. And the crystallization of such a non-aligned foreign policy has invited investments from a number of bona fide non-aligned countries. For example, the investments made by the Australian casino magnate, James Packer, then of course Shangri-La, Marriott and Hyatt can be given as ample evidence. Then of course further the crystallization of this non-aligned foreign policy had led to the inauguration of a number of mega projects. For example, the mega project, the Colombo expansion project, which was recently completed, provides that Sri Lanka is transforming itself into the hub of Asia. Thank you.